This event has been organised by the Writers Guild of Great Britain, which is the union that represents writers in Great Britain, and we're affiliated with other writers guilds around the world to negotiate for writers' rights, pay rates, and so forth. And when it comes to video games, the industry is so fragmented and so different. Where do we go with that? Well, we have Writers Guild Video Games Committee that organises events like this one and in-person events. We also do campaigning on behalf of members. We offer contract advice, and we also have the Writers Guild guidelines that talk about all sorts of things in terms of the contract conditions you should have, potential pay bands and rates that are there, and other information that you'll find useful when you're looking for a job, negotiating, or trying to work out where the heck you should be in this crazy industry. We are grateful to our sponsors today, who are Artisy and their new product, which is Artisy X, which is available at the moment and has video games capabilities for helping to plan out your narrative within it. So without further ado, I'm going to bring us across to our wonderful panel today. We have a panel of narrative designers and writers with narrative design experience, all of whom have connections with the Writers Guild of Great Britain. We've kept it sort of in the Writers Guild family today to sort of make the connections to the Writers Guild of Great Britain Video Games Committee. So let me start with Ben Sabin. You always get it first thing. I knew I was going to get that wrong. Ben Sabin, and he's a freelance narrative designer and games writer who specialises in interactive fiction and branching narratives. Over 6 years in the industry. Has covered clients such as Wizards of the Coast, Fail Better, ITV, and NDA, who is one of the biggest employers in the industry. At some point, you'll all get that magical chance to work for NDA. Although my grand said never to trust a man with a beard, you can believe that, like Ben, is working on those titles and hasn't made them up, because he's on the video games committee and is a thoroughly good chap. So Ben Sabin. Our second panelist today is Mata Haggis-Burridge, a consultant writer, narrative director, and game designer with over 20 years' experience across AAA and indie development. They are a professor at Breda University of Applied Sciences, and the credits include Burnout Paradise, Dying Light 2, strange connection, Resident Evil Resistance, and as narrative director on Superfuse and the LGBTQ plus drama Fragments of Him. That brings us to Samantha Webb, narrative designer currently at Frontier Developments with more than 5 years experience working as a professional games writer. Samantha's writing credits include Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Broken Roads, Planet Zoo, and F1 Manager series. Samantha also holds an MA degree in digital games theory and design from Brunel University and was co-chair of the Video Games Committee. That's Samantha Webb. And the chair today of this event, and currently the chair of the Writers Guild of Great Britain Video Games Committee, currently working as narrative director on Dying Light, is myself, Andrew Walsh, and I will shut up now because I'm here for the panelists to talk. We'll roll us straight into the sets of questions on this. So, what is the event about? Why have we decided to cover defining narrative design? Surely, after all of these years, the industry, which is so organized and put together, understands what the term narrative design and narrative designer mean. And we have a really clear answer on that can be shared. Generally, no. In fact, one of the questions that seems to be asked most is, what is narrative design? And if you go and look at all of the job descriptions that are out there, you will find that they vary hugely, and quite often when I'm reading them, I don't know what I'm applying for either. So we're here to try and wrangle the industry ideas about what narrative design and narrative designers are, what they do and how they do it, and that's what we're intending to cover. So while the industry hasn't managed to solve that in 30 years, we're going to try and do it in about 40 minutes or so, to leave us about 15 minutes of questions at the end. So we'll see how we get on. In fact, forget 40 minutes. We're going to now try and do it in about 4, because I'm going to pass it across to our panelists today. And please just let me know when you're ready, so that I don't surprise you. Put your hand up if you're ready to go. I'm going to ask you, each of you, what do you think people and the industry think narrative design is? And what do you think narrative design is? And let's try and keep those as concise answers, and we'll roll from there. Who wants to go into that bear pit first? Oh, yep, Ben.
Yep. All right. Hello. So what I've had people say narrative design is to me is calligraphy. I've genuinely had at least half a dozen people say, "Oh, do you make signs?" So in the industry itself, I've had a variety of things. People think I'm a writer. They also think I work with like deep in the bowels of tech and coding and stuff. And whilst some of that is true, what I think what I tend to tell people is with narrative design is it's the holistic approach of like how you can tell a story in a game through everything, not just words, but through mechanics, through the art, through the music, through the environment. So that's how I kind of describe it to potential clients and anyone else who might be a little bit confused.
Great. Mata, Samantha?
Samantha, do you want to go or shall I?
I'll go since I'm speaking. Yeah, what do other people think narrative design is? I think within the industry, if they're not already a writer of some kind, it's normally they're asking me that question, like, so what do you do? What can you help us with, right? Because they often really don't have a clue. I think the ones who have maybe worked with narrative designers before or have an idea of it tend to fall back to the writing. It's the assumption that okay, you're here to do words of some kind. I think so my kind of personal view of narrative design is that you're kind of the person on the team making that game who has the responsibility of designing what the narrative experience is like for the player. So in some cases that might be words, it might be a script, it might be working with voice actors and audio and things like that. In others it might be working really closely with like level and environment designers to do maybe a non-spoken design. But I think it's the designer who always has that viewpoint of, okay, well, how is the player going to experience this narrative? How are we going to communicate it to them? Mata, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, obviously I'm going to be building on what's been said there. Yeah, a lot of people, when they talk about narrative design, they kind of go, oh, do you get to just like come up with stories then? It's like, yeah, sort of. But usually it's more common that there's already some level of story already existing within the mind of the creative director or perhaps the whole team when you're brought on board, that you have to then try and work out a way to kind of filter it into something which is both a good story, because you might not always come into this it being a good story, and then obviously to convey that experience to the player through the various different kind of formats and techniques that we've got. But I think in some regards it's about delivering a story experience within scope and budget of availability of what the team can do. It's really about working with the whole team and trying to get the whole team on board with what you want the story experience to be. So there's a lot of time which is just spent kind of bringing in other people's ideas of what that story is going to be. There's some contemplation time, and there's time trying to work out how to embody that story with whatever tools and whatever assets you've got. That's kind of it, I think.
Great. So we got a good set of answers there, but I suppose one of the first questions that comes up following that is, haven't you defined an interactive writer? What's the difference then if somebody's arriving as a writer wanting to work in games in an interactive medium, or they want to be a narrative designer? So we have these different titles, but many of the things that you've said could be applied to a writer role as well. So is there a difference, and should there be a difference when we look at those titles? Should we split writers and narrative designers, and is there a difference?
Yes, there is a difference. Yeah, Samantha, I think you were going to jump in on that one as well. Do you want to go for it? No, okay.
What you said, yeah. Yes, there is a difference. It doesn't mean that one person can't do both of those roles, but I think the roles in themselves are different.
Yeah, very much so. So obviously the writer's role is very much here's a set of scenes that need to have dialogue added, or here's a lot of items that need descriptions written. Here's 6 levels. We know they're all fun to play, but we don't know which order we should show them to the player. Or here's 6 levels definitely happening in this order, but we've got no idea why we should connect the nuclear bunker to the bedroom. It's and sometimes you just have to come up with a story. And so the writer's job is really to create the words and the text that will be used and sometimes performed. Sometimes the writer gets involved with a little bit of the direction of the audio as well, but that's depends on the team. But yeah, the narrative designer tends to be a bit more hands-on, really working directly with a team to look at all the different tools that we've got within video games to tell stories. And that might be actually literally hands-on, like in the engine, plugging this thing into this thing to make the thing go boom. Or it could be a little bit more like having a lot of meetings. Ben?
Yeah. I think just to expand on that, I think the way I look at it is that the narrative designer tends to be someone who's a little maybe more like technical minded, understands the limitations of whatever game engine they're working in, and sort of acts as a go-between often at times with the rest of the narrative team and the wider studio. So I've also experienced it where some of the writers don't, for example, understand why they can't just write this huge elaborate scene that has all these different props and all these different animations required. And the narrative designer has to be the one who kind of curtails their enthusiasm at times and says like, okay, but like, you will kill the art team if you do this, or you will you'll drive the animators mad. So it's kind of like acting as that bridge for the narrative team and the rest of the studio as well.
I suppose one question then is, looking at the split that you've defined there, why is it that the industry and also many writers who are working within the industry find it hard to split down and this role to say narrative designers are this or writers are this, or to be able to specify it in job descriptions? So when you're coming in, we've defined one way that we could say what a narrative designer is, but the industry doesn't seem to be able to look at it in the same way. Are the reasons that this confusion has arisen? Are the points when the roles aren't as straightforward as this? What do you think the cause of the confusion is?
It's a good question, and I think that there is probably a lot more than one answer, and a lot of confusion gone into it. I think sometimes it's purely kind of what's in fashion at the moment, like what are the terms being used, and if you're going to write a job description for a role you might not already have in the studio, you're probably just going to go and look at, okay, well, what are other studios hiring for? Oh, they're all game writers. Okay, I'll do game writer. I think I've noticed it particularly a lot because I do I've done kind of a mix of freelance work, but then also being part of a studio and being permanent staff. And I think the writer roles, the roles that are classed as writers, tends to be, at least for me and what I found, more of a freelance idea. And I think it's because they kind of expect you to come in. And yeah, like I think Mata, you said, here are your scenes. This is kind of what we need. This is the objective. Go and write some stuff for us. I think there's that maybe a bit of a misconception that a writer doesn't need to really understand the context as much as a narrative designer, whereas a narrative designer, probably purely because of the word design in there, right? It kind of insinuates that they sit with the design team and they've got, like Ben, I think that's what you said, that hands-on experience and things like that. But honestly, I think a lot of the time it's just this confusion over writing as a technical craft and where does it sit and what do we mean. And there is a lot of crossover. I don't think there's any getting away from that, especially if you are maybe an indie studio. You might only have one person or even half a person doing the words. So, they might have to encompass all of these different roles. So maybe it's just easier to kind of pick something like game writer that sounds a bit more generic than narrative designer that might sound more specific. I wish there was an easy answer, because then it would be an easy problem to solve, right? But I don't think there is one. True,
but then we wouldn't have anything to do the panel about, and it would be very embarrassing sitting here in silence. So I think one thing to sort of say coming out of this is it appears to be that if you are sitting there with a measure of confusion about this, and you think, oh, I feel a bit silly, or I don't know where I'm approaching this incorrectly from, it's not your fault. The industry is still figuring all of this out and how it crosses over. So take that fear and relegate it to not your fault on that one. We'll work through. So would anyone like to add to what Samantha was saying?
Yeah, I think actually something also to what you're saying there is like if you're applying for a job as a narrative designer, read the spec very carefully because they might have a different idea than the other job that's being advertised for a narrative designer. Two job adverts may be asking for completely different skill sets. So do look at that. Well, I say completely different. They'll be related, but they're in a Venn diagram. There might be there won't be a circle. So yeah, and also just in interviews, do talk with them like what you perceive it to be and what they perceive it to be to just make sure there's a good skill match there when going into it. I know from my perspective, I think one of the reasons that we're not very good at defining this at the moment is that we're not very good at defining most stuff in the games industry. We only really invented HR departments in the games industry about 10 years ago. And a lot of companies still haven't really kind of caught up with this idea yet. What does a creative director on a game do? Yeah, they could be anything from like full-on gameplay thing to just talking with the people who film the cutscenes. So it's really I think it's also just part of the immaturity of the way that industry is built quite often. That we don't have kind of really good specifications of what we're supposed to do here. So yeah, and I think it's just emblematic of the whole industry that people don't really know. But yeah, I think narrative design particularly is a bit of a weaker point in terms of definition because also you could be working in the same studio on two different games and have a different role in it. It depends how much narrative there is and what tools and techniques they want to convey the story with. So some games won't have any script at all. Other games will be entirely about the story and nothing else. So it does change from project to project. So
amongst the people that we have here, then let's say if you had to define the role, as I had to do recently, to actually put job adverts out there to say we would like writers and we would like narrative designers, what set of skills would you say you would put into one basket or the other, or particularly looking at narrative design, where would you start listing the skills that are necessary for this role? So now we've explored it a little bit. Let's try and nail it down with how would you define it if you were writing the job description?
I think that for me, a lot of it is about communication skills and collaboration with the team. As a storyteller in games, stories are never seen as the big selling point, or very rarely seen as the big selling point. It's always about gameplay. In the end, it's about gameplay innovation, and that's really what sells and what people kind of talk about when they think of games development. So trying to get people excited about a story and on board with a story and understanding the value of a story, for me, it requires really good collaboration skills. And from that, there's a lot of listening, of just like understanding which team, so the animation team, the art team, the audio team, which one of those has a capacity to include some new little twist you want in your story, and which ones don't. We have to really work with the producer to make sure that the work that you want to get in there is going to function. On a nitty-gritty level, it's things like blueprinting, like understanding how to sequence stuff together and make one piece of audio play after another piece of audio. I once did a bit in a game where we had 10 soldiers who could be picked off individually by a monster, and I had to make sure that, and the way that the system worked, it didn't know when a person was dead. So it could be that I'd have somebody kept shouting, "Oh no, Bill's gone," but it could have been the corpse we just beheaded on the floor shouting, "Oh no, Bill's gone." So I had to work out a system which wasn't embedded in the game at all to make sure that there was a check. And it was essentially this massive branching flowchart to make sure dead people weren't shouting from the floor. And that was what being a narrative designer was in that particular moment for that particular scene. So it does require some hands-on skills at times, as well as all the collaboration stuff and the background writing stuff and the big storytelling parts. And sometimes it's just writing dialogue. So it's a real craft spectrum, I would say. Ben, I see you've...
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, just to kind of add on to that, I think for the different kind of job specs, I would be looking for someone who is a little bit more technical minded, and by that I mean someone who can think a bit systemically, can think a bit like non-linearly. Because with writers, when I've worked with writers who have come, say, from a TV background in the past, they're very linear. They they understand you go from plot A to point B, and what happens in between is what's important. And yeah, for some games that's fine. That's they're linear. That's how they work. But if you're working in an interactive space, which you were kind of alluding to there, about like all these different variables you can have, it's the ability to look at a flowchart and get excited versus look at a flowchart and go, oh my god, no, I don't want to write all these variations. Get it away from me. I hate it. Narrative designers are generally suckers for flowcharts. It's our real bread and butter. So yeah, do you like flowchart? That's the first question in an interview.
I love a good flowchart.
Who doesn't?
Oh, I know. They just make things so clear. I mean, I agree with what Ben and Mata have both been saying. I think just one thing that I would add from a obviously incredibly simplified, but if I was looking purely for a game writer, it sounds ridiculous, but I'd expect you to be able to write. As in from it's like I'd expect you to probably have a pretty good grasp of how to write a script, how to work with voice actors, or at least how to prepare a script for voice actors and voice directors, and have more of a real kind of focus into that. Whereas if you're going into narrative design, again, like if you came onto my team as a narrative designer, I would expect you to have not like a professional working knowledge of game design, but you've got to have a good grasp of the basics, because the clue's in the design again, right? Like you are a designer on that team. So okay, your focus is on the narrative, but you're working so closely with the game designers, you have to know what they're doing and why they're doing what they're doing. And again, I'm going to say this throughout the entire talk, probably there's still a lot of crossover. I wouldn't expect either of those to be in isolation, but yeah, I think as a narrative designer, you've got to understand how games are designed and put together. But as a game writer, you need to have really strong craft skills in actual writing things down, taking feedback, writing dialogue, etc., etc.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it, because there really is this balance between a writer for linear stuff only needs to be really good at the craft. Only needs to be only good at the craft. The kind of a writer for video games needs to be really good at the craft, but also know kind of how games work. They need to understand branching. They need to understand variables. They need to understand implications of oh yeah, actually I'm just going to do this other scene in a a graveyard, and I'm going to chuck one in a Roman monastery, and you're like, oh yeah, but that's just not in budget at all. You've got to be able to understand how that works and kind of reuse of assets and these little parts there, but you don't need to know everything. And then you get across to kind of the narrative designer, where you really should be good at writing, but it's not the core only thing, and you're going to have a lot more of those kind of design skills and lots more hands-on technical skills, and it's kind of it's a balance between these things. And I think the more you go towards the designer part, the more the balance of the technical skills comes in there. Then if you become a narrative director, some regards often you don't need so many of the technical skills. You need to know what the technical skills need to be, but not actually do it, because you've got so much time spent in meetings trying to make sure everybody else is okay doing the things you're doing, as management often is.
As a narrative director, I can confirm that you should not let me near the technical bits myself, because I will delete half your game by accident. But I know how to talk to the people that can do it properly. I would hope. So I think, so coming from that, if you're approaching this amongst the people that are attending today from outside the games industry, wanting to know, can I bring my writing skills in, and should I be looking to apply as a narrative designer? Again, read the job descriptions, because sometimes it could be a writing job with one little bit of narrative design on it. But it's that understanding where the branching comes from, and it doesn't have to be choice where it goes, do you want to go left or right? It can just be the choice to, what happens if the player chooses to stand around for 20 minutes and do nothing? What happens if they shoot the person on the left and not the person on the right? And all of those things can branch the situation or change the way that you would approach the writing. So I think as a writer, you should understand that, but as a narrative designer, you're probably one of the people that's putting those choices in front of the writers. But we've also mentioned another group here, just to make it even more confusing, because we've added in game design. So is game design a separate thing from narrative design? Where does that crossover go? Because we've been looking at writers, and now let's look over that way. Where does game design and narrative design cross over? Does it?
I think I would say yes. I think like historically, if you look at how games were made 20 years ago, often the writers were the game designers, with varying levels of quality, obviously. The discipline was not like there. If they did need a writer, they often outsourced it to, say, a TV writer or like a novelist. And then I think that's where we started to then see actual like games writers coming from. But then there was that weird intersection where they didn't know the technical side of it, and I think that's where like it kind of formed this narrative designer role. And so yeah, there's definitely a crossover. I do actually say, and I might be one of the only people that does, but I do often say like narrative design is an offshoot of game design. We are game designers who are narrative focused. um but we just don't, we're not just focusing on the mechanics, we're focusing on the story, we're focusing on the audio, the art, etc., etc. So yeah, I think there's definitely a big crossover there, and I think it is one of the key differences between like why we don't just say we're writers, because that's not true. Yeah, that's why I have to say on that bit.
Yeah, I think so the way I almost see it is that narrative design does sit at, so you've got the umbrella of game design, and then obviously, as a game designer, maybe you specialize in environment design, maybe you specialize in level design, maybe you specialize in balancing the game, which by the way is like a black magic. I don't know how people do that. Maths, I think, is the answer. But then game design is kind of in that umbrella, but I think it's in that umbrella, but you're only half in under that umbrella. This is a really bad analogy, sorry everyone. You're half under that umbrella, so half of you sitting within that game design area. But then I think to be a truly effective narrative designer, you can't just sit in there. So the same way that you gain, as a level designer, you're probably going to be working quite closely with art at some point to be like, oh, hey, can I design this? Do we have the assets to support it? How difficult is it to make that monastery you were talking about, Mata? Can we add that in? I think the narrative designer then has to have that other half of them looking and interacting directly with audio, localization, maybe UI if they're doing like the UI copy as well, and maybe even like external freelance writers or working with creative direction. I don't think you can just sit within, I'm saying not that game designers do this at all, but you can't sit within that game design bubble the entire time. You've got to kind of go into these other areas.
So this is one of those that, if you ever get cornered by somebody that's that is into interactive writing, and you want to do that impressive bit to impress people as well, narrative designers do narrative mechanics and game designers do game mechanics, which is one of those really easy sounding splits. And so you then ask, well, what's a narrative mechanic and what's a game mechanic? And suddenly you realize that they overlap a huge amount. So there's separations in some ways and overlap in others. So some of the reason you're getting slightly fuzzy answers is it's easy to give you those sentences that then actually become meaningless as soon as you get into all of the detail as it trickles through. So before we switch over sort of more towards the questions that we're getting through on the chat channel, to give a bit more of an idea on a practical level, what is a day in the life of a narrative designer? So we've talked a bit about like what the skills are, but what do you do when you get up and you sort of walk into the office or get up and walk to the computer? What are the regular tasks that you're up to?
That'll depend where we are in the project. If you're at the start of the project, I'm usually trying to work out a timeline of events in the game. So I'm trying to work out what happened before the player starts playing that's going to inform the narrative. I'm going to be trying to work out what the sequence is that we're expecting the player to go through and trying to make sure whether that aligns with the game design department. And then I'm also trying to make sure where the ending gets to. I saw a comment earlier about plot structure. This is kind of the time earlier on the project where I'm looking at plot structure, trying to make sure kind of your key beats of like your crisis moments, your low midpoints and stuff like that. These are going to be roughly in the gameplay experience where we want them to be. I might be having meetings with mission designers to talk about how the highs and lows of each mission are put together, see if we've got a decent twist, sort of a midpoint or about 75 or 80% midpoint on the mission, to make sure the narrative is quite interesting, to see if it ties thematically in with the bigger thing. Having meetings with creative director to decide on things like thematic content. What is this game actually about in a narrative sense? Later on, it will be really working through a lot of the missions, making sure that we've got the tools developed to make sure that we can tell the story in the way we want to tell it. Quite often when you go to a team and you want to try something that's got branching in it, a lot of teams have never done this before. They've really just set themselves up for linear things. So looking at the tool set that's there, designing that tool set to make sure it meets the needs of the game, establishing naming conventions for variables. Oh my God, the most boring sounding thing in the world, but it's so damned important to have good naming conventions for your variables. So really nitty gritty stuff of that like this, which it just means that the game becomes manageable. And then sometimes it is like a designer will come to you and go, right, I've got all the combat done. Now we need the narrative event. Can you hook up the narrative for me? And it's just making sure that the characters are standing in the right place and the right animation is queued up, and the right animation is filmed by the motion capture team. Making sure the right audio is playing. And then later on in the game, it becomes about testing, making sure that if you shoot Fred in the head, Bill doesn't go, oh, good, when Bill's supposed to be sad. You know, it's making sure that the flow of it still makes sense. Oh, for people who are sight impaired, I'm a person, white person, male presenting, wearing dark rimmed glasses with spiky punk hair, which used to be bleached, but is now just turning grey by itself. And stubble. So I'm wearing a dark grey t-shirt. There you go, for sight impaired people. So you've got a better picture of me. Anybody else got any other things? What do you folks do on a day-to-day basis? Sam, Ben?
I guess just quickly then, for sight impaired people, I am also a male presenting white guy with long blonde hair and a beard, and I realise I'm wearing 2 different shades of green because that's how I'm rolling today. Where am I going with this? I've worked. So I think probably fair to say out of the 2 others here, I tend to work with much smaller teams. I come from like an indie background and a mobile game background, so I tend to I don't have all those people at my disposal usually to work with. So my day looks a bit different. Depending on what we're doing, it will be. Again, if it's at the start, it's very similar. It's setting out its plot, like plotting the plot, working out the characters, working with the actual core writers to help them enhance their like characterizations, do some edits, etc. But then day to day, it will be like working on those flowcharts I mentioned earlier. If I'm doing something like an interactive visual novel, then obviously that's all about, well, where does it break? What are the major branches? And you don't have to plot out every single one. You don't have to be like, okay, you're offered a bacon sandwich or a cheese sandwich. Which one do you choose? Like the minor choices don't need it, but what you do need is like the big breaks and what does that look like and how does that affect the rest of the game? And more importantly, how do you square it all away at the end? But then when it's actually down to the nitty gritty, I'm in engine and I'm writing, and I'm often also, depending on what program we're using, doing some kind of code to be the one that's like, okay, the character appears on this side and does this and blah 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 blah. So if you're coming from a smaller space as a narrative designer, your day is going to look very different to someone working in the AAA sphere, and you are going to be a lot more like essentially like hands-on building the stuff yourself, whilst also talking to the rest of the teams and that.
Samantha, would you like to go?
Oh, yes, hello. I need to do my visual introduction as well, which I forgot. So I'm basically a white woman with long dark hair. I would like to point out that my hair is longer than Ben's, just in case there is any confusion around that. But yeah, I think when it comes to day-to-day, more meetings than you would expect, I think, is the answer for those who haven't done the role already. And I know that sounds awful because nobody wants to be in meetings, right? But the reality is, like, I work remote. I have done since before the pandemic even happened. So, I've been doing this for a long time. It's very important to have regular syncs and regular like touching base with people, because you don't get that kind of organic conversation that you would just being around the office. So it might feel annoying to have a stand up every day or a sync with that person once a week, but first of all, it's actually strengthening those kind of professional relationships, because you talk about what you did at the weekend or that cool new film that you watched or whatever. But also, like making games is collaborative. If you want to be sitting there writing by yourself, then be a novelist. Like eventually you'll still have to work with an editor and take on feedback. But you know, most of the work I do is collaborating. If it's not sitting in a meeting or in a Zoom call like this, talking to people and talking through what we're doing and what we're planning, it's sitting with the designers and going through a feature design so that I can kind of point out all the things they're not allowed to do because it doesn't work with our audio, or because we don't have the localization budget or whatever. But yeah, just like a lot of collaboration, a lot of checking in. I've learned the hard way that it's always better to check in quickly and often than it is to spend days and days creating this incredible thing that you've built only to take it to the game director and for him to like look at the first page and be like, no, we can't do that. And it's like, oh, oops. So yeah, lots of checking in with people, and also just being nosy about what other people are doing so you can make sure they're not accidentally breaking something narrative. And I think the rest of the time is kind of like, there are those bits where I'll go off and I'll spend an hour designing something or putting a page together or doing a flowchart, doing some Excel, and then I'll check in with people to be like, what do you think of this? What do you think of this? And then kind of go on the iteration. Every so often I'll have like a full a week of just afternoons with literally do not disturb, headset on, music playing, and actually just sitting down and writing, because you know, once you kind of know all of your constraints and things like that, eventually you just have to sit down and do the work. And the other one, so quite a lot of the games that I've worked on have been voiced as well. So when it kind of gets to the point, like I tend to sit in on recording sessions. I'm lucky that I've always worked with an audio person. So there's always been someone who is more qualified than me to actually kind of do that interaction. But I'm still there to make sure that if they do change a line, it doesn't contradict gameplay or game mechanics or use terminology that we haven't agreed on, etc., etc. So I'm kind of there listening, and I can also give more of an indication of if you're working with multiple characters, maybe what one character's relationship to another is, so you can keep that as tight as possible. So yeah, it really is different day to day, but lots of meetings. Just be prepared for the meetings.
So I'm Andy, and I didn't do the description either. So I'm a middle-aged guy with the least impressive hair out of everybody here, but the pinkest shirt. So, but I think there's been a couple of different things that have come through in the things there. And I think one is that it's difficult to define narrative design because it's difficult to design what a video game is. So therefore, what a narrative designer is going to do will vary hugely depending upon the type of game that you're making. If you're making a tennis game for children versus a first-person combat game for mass market versus a third-person role-playing game, there's going to be hugely different types of roles and demands on each on any of those roles, which makes it difficult to define in one way. And that does lead me on to, before that, yes, communications is one thing that gets forgotten a lot. And once you get into the industry, communications are key. So if you're in theatre and you're doing that work, you'll probably get a bit of theatre and you'll be there in rehearsals. If you're working in TV and film, maybe you'll know that they're shooting about a week after it's happened, or you'll get calls about it, but you're often a bit more distant from it. And as a games writer, you can sometimes be being sent things to fill in, whereas narrative design is in the middle of the process. As a writer, it's good if you can be. If you're employing writers, try and put them into the middle of it, but sometimes they're more external, whereas the narrative designers are in there talking and trying to make sure that everything lines up. Which brings me to narrative mechanics. We've used that term a few times, and some people may think it refers to software or it refers to, so what sorts of things would you define as, aware of the fact that they can be different depending upon whatever game you're working on, what sort of things would you define as narrative mechanics, and so that people can get an idea about the types of thing that you're working with? What do you commonly work with?
I've got a picture, kind of. So this is a picture, a diagram I did for Develop Brighton a few years ago, and I've got a whole like 45-minute talk about this, which I won't go into now. But essentially speaking, there's a few different things that I work with to try and tell a story. So we've got dialogue and performance, obviously the writing, the script, how people perform it, getting good actors, voice direction, triggering lines and stuff like that. That's the really obvious stuff. Visuals, obviously, we've got environmental storytelling. If you're new to the industry, environmental storytelling is essentially moments of story which are conveyed purely through visuals, typically. Sometimes with animation happening, sometimes it's just a still scene. There's an example of this in Fallout where there's two skeletons lying dead on a bed, and next to them is a tiny bottle of poison. And the idea is that they couldn't face the apocalypse and they decided to die together. So, you know, that kind of thing can be environmental storytelling, and visuals are very powerful for that. Obviously, it does take your whole team to do that. Audio can be really, really good. It can build a lot of atmosphere, and it can be really powerful, like you imagine a door that just swishes open, gives a very different idea from a door that kind of go creaking open. So really how the audio works can really tell a lot of the work about how the history of a place is working. Haptic is a word for kind of vibration, feelable feedback. Don't tend to use it in PC games, but obviously in consoles where you've got vibrating controllers and stuff like that, it can be quite interesting and just quite complementary to the story, but not such a big storytelling tool. Choice and interaction, obviously big ones, like converging branches, different systems of telling stories can be really powerful in there. We do a lot of work thinking about that. And when we think about gameplay mechanics and storytelling mechanics, how you do choice and how the game responds to you in either for the next 3 minutes, you're going to be fighting this person rather than this person, or whether from now on, your companion is dead or your companion's been transformed into a dog. And these kind of things can really make a big difference to how the game works and the stories that you want to tell. And how we use choice and interaction is a really powerful thing in terms of how we want to tell a story. And there's a lot of debate about how much choice should there be in a game. And finally, context is one which I think about as like things like the sequence that a player sees something in changes how they see it. If they see blood on the floor and then they see a zombie, they get a different idea. They're going to go, oh, someone was hurt. Oh, and I've turned into a zombie. Whereas you see a zombie first, you go, oh my God, there's things here. And then there's blood on the floor. You think the zombie killed the person. So the way that we change the sequence, the how long you see something, these kind of contextual cues are really important. And talking about those with a team and how we want to manage those, I think is really important. I'm going to take that off screen now, but I just wanted to kind of share that these are the kind of my answer to kind of what are narrative tools. These are the things that these are kind of the levers that we've got to pull on a very broad theoretical scale rather than the kind of practical, blueprinting kind of scale. These are the levers we've got to pull in a game. I think that's most of them, but I'm not sure.
So coders and programmers work in one way. There can be some crossover with narrative designers. That's when we get into technical narrative designers, which is a term that's sometimes used, not always used. But you also get like narrative designers at the other end that are systemic narrative designers who design things more digitally or on paper. And again, those terms you will find vary in their uses to make it more confusing. Internships, is that a way in through narrative design? Are there internships up there, and how can writers move into this area? Who would like to take that one?
I think there are maybe one or two internships when it comes specifically to narrative design. Like there are, it's something that I hope we see more and more of, because I think internships in some of the other, especially around like art and animation and game design, I think they are more common. I would definitely say do not, if you can find a narrative internship and you get one, great, but don't make that your plan, because there's certainly not enough of them at all for that to be part of it. I think you're much better off making little games of your own, whether that, I've seen people kind of mention Twine. Ink is also a really good one to get used to that. Basically just to get that feel of how is writing for a game different, is to do with the interaction, right? So do with the player and the way the player kind of sees the narrative. Like I've, so just for context, I have, in my current role, I have been part of interview panels and selection panels for junior and full kind of game writers and narrative designers come through. I've hired people who don't have any games experience, but when I got their CV and their portfolio is a website full of tiny little 5-minute games that they've just gone off and made themselves. And it's like, you know, I don't need you to be an expert or to have industry knowledge in anything when you can just demonstrate that you've gone out of your way to play around with this and experiment with it and learn as you go. Yeah, I think that's a much better off way. Obviously, personal opinion, like obviously do look for the internships, but yeah, I definitely don't expect that to be part of your plan to get into the industry.
So very quickly is one question that's come in. Could you, in a nutshell, and I know this is not easy, describe how you ended up being a narrative designer? As we don't often have internships, what was your journey to into the industry and this particular role?
Yeah, so for me, I came from a different industry completely. I worked in IBM as a technical consultant for about 5 years before I even considered going across into games. I was exceptionally lucky that I was in a good position, both financially and professionally, to do an MA in game design. I've always been a writer. I think most writers are the same, right? We've written since we were little. We've always had that dream of being a novelist or just professionally, just someone pay me to write things. But I realized when I was trying to join game jams and things like that, I was like, I don't really know how games work. So personally, doing a master's was kind of the right thing for me. I was basically doing a lot of agile coaching and like team dev management stuff. So I basically like snuck into the games industry using those skills. And then once I got into the games industry, I started like massively building out my network. I was lucky again to find a couple of mentors who were game writers at different studios. And then I went to a networking event and got my first role literally through doing a game writer. In fact, Writers Guild networking event. So go to them if you get the opportunity. So yeah, it was. There's always a bit of luck involved, I think, because you know, there's tough industries to get to, and it's a role that lots of people want to do. But there's a lot that you can do for yourself to prepare for that. And also, don't worry. Like, you know, whenever I see the 30 under 30 in games, I'm like, I was older than 30 when I joined the game industry. You know, like it's never too late, so don't worry, especially if there are any kind of grads watching or students who are worried about not getting a job straight away. Don't worry about it. Do whatever you have to do. Do whatever jobs are available and just practice in your spare time. It's never going to be too late for you to come across into the industry, so you need to be a bit tenacious.
Mata, Ben?
Yeah, I came in, I actually got into the industry. So originally I was in marketing. I got into the industry through marketing. I was at Bossa for a year and then decided that what I really wanted to do was get into narrative. And yeah, that was the end goal anyway. So I left there and I went freelance for a couple of months. This was back in 2018. And I basically did what Samantha's already said. Like I, made a couple of small little narrative games, but I also, just because the question got asked, and I can answer it now. Yes, I did write like a Twine game, which was how my first like boss, the narrative, found me and saw me and decided on hiring me. But accompanying that, I also had a script. I didn't just because if you do have like an interactive game like a Twine game, in order for them to actually see the effective use of your branching, they're gonna have to replay it multiple times, and no one who's hiring is going to do that. So what I had alongside it was a script of the whole thing, which had a weird version of how I was showing what the branches did. And there's no set like format for that kind of script writing. You just if as long as it's consistent and it makes sense, like go for it. And I was able to provide that script alongside my application, and therefore he played the game, liked the writing, liked the use, but also could then see how my branching brain worked. So yeah, it was a bit of luck. I also only found out about that opportunity because I networked. And one thing I found actually quite useful was to network with other writers and other narrative designers, because if they pass on an opportunity or if they see an opportunity but they don't need it, they will send it to you. And that's exactly what happened to me. And then they were also able to put a good word in with me to the studio. So yeah, it is a lot of luck, but you can make your own luck, and you can also make sure you're prepared for when that luck does strike.
My one's a bit of a shorter one. I was working in the games industry as an indie game developer for 7 years or so, running my own company, and I could do programming, I could do art, I could do writing. I went into the mainstream game industry as a games designer, and when I was on the Aliens vs Predator project in 2010, there was a need to get the narrative integrated better into the levels, and I was very passionate about it, and so I stepped up and took on that role as much as I could because I loved writing. So I started actually as a level designer and a game designer, kind of in the bigger industry, and then shifted from level and game design across into the narrative design side of it. So if you are, quite often there's not that many people on the team. There'll be some people like, yay, I want to write, and there's going to be a bunch of people who are just like, I don't care, I love shooting aliens in the face. If you can be one of the people who's, yay, I want to write, and you can show that you're actually half decent at it and you can be trusted, a lot of teams are quite open to letting people have a go at it. I put in the kind of comments that joining up with game jams can be a really good way of doing this, because there's teams, they're making a thing, and they're going to have programmers, they're going to have artists, they may or may not have a good writer on board, and you could just, within a weekend, you could get something for your portfolio which is playable and fun, and you never know, you might even get offered a job out of it. I know a bunch of people who are out of game jams have ended up working with teams later on.
So there are various events you can go for. Sadly, Adventure X is one that's normally really good, and that's taken a pause this year, but it's one to look out for. Next year is a great place to go. And the Writers Guild organises networking events. We are hoping to have one in Brighton alongside Develop. Details will follow. And we also hope to have some more in central London later this year. Those are free and open to people to come along, so we hope that you can join us at one of those. We'll do one last question because I know we're sort of hitting the time, I believe. So we have, what are your preferred programs to make share flowcharts with the broader team? Because we've talked about the flowcharts, the joy of flowcharts, but what's the software that you tend to use or you find the most intuitive or at least less annoying?
I use Miro. It's an online whiteboard. And I literally just do it with the sticky notes, because if you're in a physical team in an office space, you're going to be using a whiteboard or a big roll piece of paper that you can then turn to a scroll, and you're just going to be sticking sticky notes onto it. So Miro just does that for you virtually, and it's a lovely, easy use of kit. And I'm pretty sure most narrative designers now just use it. It's great.
Anybody using anything else? Just because we're not. Oh, go ahead.
Just use PowerPoint or like Google Sheets, depending on the project. I am very good with words. I'm not so good with pictures. Anyone who has sat in on one of my talks before with one of my PowerPoints, it's like, you know, they're basic, and my flowcharts are basic, but they are functional. I think that's the important thing. Yeah, I do a lot of especially in the very early stages where I'm kind of brainstorming stuff as well. I do have a notebook, and I do often just put down really simple flowcharts in there and then literally just photograph and share with the team, because there's something about that physical act of drawing that works with my creative brain. And if I really needed to look more presentable, I put that into a PowerPoint instead.
Yeah, and I think someone's also pointed out Lucid is another one which can be used. If you're submitting things to companies, make sure that you're using something that can export in a way that people can then read it. And remember that they don't have to be fancy. The main thing is they have to be clear to read. So you're looking for clarity rather than things with bells and whistles and necessarily amazing performing bits. The bit that people really need from these flowcharts is to be able to look at them and get it. So making them sort of concise is really important. I wish we could continue, because I feel like we're sort of really beginning to sort of mine all of these bits, but we have come to the end of today. So I'm going to quickly thank our sponsors, Artisy, who provide some software that will help you with some of these elements as well, in terms of like plotting out plots and dialogue. I'd like to thank the Writers Guild staff and committee for helping put this together. Look out for our events, because we have more like this, and we also have the networking events. I'd like to thank our amazing panelists, and I'd also like to thank all the attendees for giving your time today to come along, ask your amazing questions, and make sure we weren't sitting on our own talking to ourselves, because that's quite an important bit of this process. So please go out. Don't take the fear away, any fear away from this. We hope we've managed to open those curtains and dispel some of that fear and let the light in. So please, all the best with your projects, and thank you very much for coming.